Officers encounter Chuck Norris in a diner, but then they see it on his desk. Where are you watching from? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more inspiring stories. It was a chilly November evening in 2007 when three off-duty police officers walked into a quiet diner in Silver Lake, Los Angeles. They were laughing, swapping stories, and scanning the place for a table. At the far corner near the window sat a man who looked vaguely familiar, dressed in a plain denim shirt and rugged jeans. His signature beard was neatly trimmed, but at first glance, he appeared unremarkable. Little did they know this unassuming figure was Chuck Norris, the martial arts legend and action star known for his understated demeanor. The officers exchanged smirks and whispered to one another, wondering why someone like him would be alone in a diner that late. "Isn't that guy supposed to be a millionaire?" one of them scoffed. "Looks like he's taking a night off from saving the world," another chuckled. Their voices weren't as low as they thought. Chuck, calmly sipping his coffee, glanced up briefly and offered a polite nod. When the officers approached his table, it wasn't to greet him warmly. Standing over him with their badges gleaming in the dim light, they cracked jokes about his appearance. "Hey buddy, planning to roundhouse kick the specials tonight?" one teased. Another chimed in, "You paying for that coffee, or should we start a collection with our tears?" Chuck, ever composed, simply nodded, thanked them for their service, and returned to reading a leather-bound journal resting on the table. His calm demeanor seemed to frustrate them further. "What's that?" "Your training manual for the next Delta Force mission," one officer sneered, leaning closer. Chuck remained silent, flipping the page, but then something caught their attention. Beside the journal lay a worn, folded piece of paper with intricate, childlike drawings. At first, it seemed insignificant, a mere scribble perhaps, but the closer they looked, the clearer it became. The drawings were unmistakably those of a young child's drawing. Each figure, surrounded by little notes and uneven handwriting, caught the officer's attention. One of them leaned in for a closer look and froze. Scrawled in bright marker were the words, "Thank you for being my hero, Uncle Chuck. Love, Emma." Their smirks faded as realization set in. Chuck Norris was known for his quiet acts of kindness, but this felt different. The officers exchanged uneasy glances, suddenly unsure of themselves. The edges of the paper were taped together, as if it had been cherished for years. Doodles showed a man holding hands with a young girl, stick figures laughing, and one labeled, "Best Day Ever." A little girl on a movie set, riding on the back of a man who was kicking the bad guys. The tension in the air shifted. The officers, once brimming with confidence, now stepped back, their bravado replaced by quiet reflection. Chuck looked up, noticing their changed expressions, but remained silent. His journal lay open, revealing glimpses of heartfelt letters, poems, and newspaper clippings. The officers couldn't help but wonder, what was the story behind the drawings? Who was Emma? And why did this mean so much to Chuck? Without another word, they left the diner. But something about that moment stayed with them. As Chuck finished his coffee, he placed a generous tip on the table and stepped outside. The mystery of his life lingered in the minds of those who had crossed his path that evening. And just like that, Chuck Norris disappeared into the night, carrying stories only he truly understood. As Chuck stepped into the brisk night air, the officer's ridicule faded into the background, but the weight of the folded paper in his pocket did not. He walked slowly to his pickup truck, the hum of the city blending with his thoughts. The letter from Emma wasn't just a sentimental keepsake. It was a lifeline, a reminder of a bond forged through tragedy and resilience. Emma's story began years earlier, in 2003, when Chuck's life was touched by loss. Grief had become an unwelcome companion, one he carried silently, choosing to channel his pain into acts of compassion. It was during this time that he met Emma. Emma, was the 6-year-old daughter of Chuck's childhood friend, Tom. A single father since losing his wife to cancer, Tom had done his best to care for Emma, but life had become a relentless struggle. Noticing his old friend's exhaustion and Emma's quiet sadness, Chuck began visiting regularly, bringing books, toys, and, most importantly, his undivided attention. It wasn't long before he and Emma formed a bond that went beyond friendship. She called him Uncle Chuck, and he called her his bright star. They spent hours drawing, playing pretend, and sharing stories. Wise beyond her years, Emma had a way of making Chuck smile when no one else could. But as life often does, it dealt another cruel hand. In 2006, Tom was diagnosed with a rare illness that progressed rapidly. Devastated, Chuck did everything in his power to support his friend and Emma. He covered medical bills, stayed by Tom's side during treatments, and ensured Emma felt loved and secure. When Tom passed away later that year, Emma's world fell apart. Orphaned at 9, Emma was on the verge of being placed into foster care. Chuck, unwilling to let her face such uncertainty, stepped in without hesitation. Though not her biological father, he became her legal guardian, pouring every ounce of his energy into ensuring she felt safe, cherished, and understood. The letter that had caught the officer's attention in the diner was Emma's way of expressing gratitude on her 12th birthday. "Thank you for showing me what love is," one line read. Chuck carried it everywhere, a testament to the family he had built from the ashes of sorrow. As he drove his pickup through the quiet streets of Los Angeles, that night his thoughts drifted to Emma, now 17 and preparing to graduate high school. She had blossomed into a vibrant, compassionate young woman with dreams of becoming an artist. She often teased him for being overly protective, but never failed to remind him how much she loved him. What the officers didn't know, what most people didn't know, was that Chuck had dedicated his entire life to ensuring Emma's future was as bright as her spirit. Every choice he made, every project he took on, was for her. And yet, even with all his efforts, a shadow loomed. Emma had recently been diagnosed with a serious health condition, one that required extensive treatment. The thought of losing her, of facing another unbearable loss, haunted Chuck. But as always, he buried his pain, focusing instead on being her unwavering pillar of strength. As he pulled into the driveway of their modest home, the porch light flickered on. Emma stood in the doorway, sketchbook in hand, a smile lighting up her face despite the fatigue in her eyes. "Hey, Uncle Chuck," she called out, her voice soft but warm. "You're late. I made dinner, but don't get too excited, it's just spaghetti." Chuck chuckled, the weight of the day momentarily lifting. "Spaghetti sounds perfect," he said, walking toward her. Inside the house, every corner held a memory, a framed sketch of their adventures, photographs of laughter-filled moments, and books stacked haphazardly on every surface. It wasn't a home built on wealth or glamour, but on love and resilience. As they sat down to eat, Emma opened her sketchbook and showed Chuck her latest drawing. It was a picture of the two of them sitting under a tree, smiling. Beneath it, she had written, "Family is who you hold on to when the world lets go." Chuck felt a lump in his throat but didn't let it show. Instead, he reached across the table, squeezed her hand and said, "You're my bright star, Emma. Always." The challenges ahead were daunting, but they knew they would face them together. Their bond was unbreakable, their love steadfast. That night, after dinner, Chuck sat alone in the quiet of his small study. The walls were lined with books and Emma's artwork, each piece a reflection of her resilience and creativity. In the center of his desk lay the journal he carried everywhere, its pages filled with fragments of their journey together. He turned to a fresh page and began writing, his pen trembling slightly in his hand. He wrote about the first time Emma smiled after her father's death, a fleeting moment during a silly game of charades. He wrote about the night she stayed up late to finish a painting for an art competition and how her face lit up when she won first place. These memories, these threads of hope, were what held him together. But tonight, the fear he had been suppressing for months finally broke through. Emma's condition was worsening, and for the first time in years, Chuck Norris felt powerless. Emma's health had been deteriorating faster than anyone expected. The doctors remained optimistic but cautious, warning that the treatment would be grueling. Chuck had done everything possible to shield her from the worst of it, but he could see the toll it was taking. The sparkle in her eyes dimmed a little more each day, replaced by an exhaustion no child should ever have to endure. He closed the journal and leaned back, staring at the ceiling. He was used to carrying burdens, to enduring silently. But this was different. This wasn't about him. This was about Emma, the one person he couldn't bear to lose. A soft knock on the door broke his thoughts. "Uncle Chuck?" Her voice was hesitant. "Come in," he called, quickly wiping his eyes. Emma stepped inside, her sketchbook clutched to her chest. The oversized sweater she wore made her small frame seem even more fragile. "I couldn't sleep," she admitted. Chuck gestured for her to sit beside him. She climbed onto the chair, tucking her legs underneath her. "I was thinking about Dad tonight," she said quietly. He nodded, letting her continue. "Do you think he'd be proud of me?" Her voice trembled. Chuck felt his heart twist. "Emma, your dad would be so proud of you," he said firmly. "You're brave, kind and talented. Everything he dreamed you'd be." Tears welled in her eyes, but she smiled. "Sometimes I feel like he's still here, watching over us." Chuck reached out, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "He is," he said softly. "And so is your mom. They'd both be so proud of how strong you've been." Emma hesitated, then slowly opened her sketchbook. Emma flipped to a fresh page in her sketchbook. "I started drawing something for you," she said, handing it over. Chuck looked down and saw the beginnings of a portrait, his face framed by a halo of light. Beneath it, she had written, "You're my hero." For the first time in years, Chuck couldn't hold back his emotions. Tears streamed down his face as he pulled Emma into a gentle hug. "No," he whispered, his voice breaking. "You're my hero, Emma." They stayed like that for a long time, the weight of their shared pain and love filling the room. Neither knew what the future would hold, but in that moment, they found solace in each other. Their bond stronger than any hardship. Later, after Emma had fallen asleep, Chuck returned to his desk and opened the journal again. He wrote one line at the top of the page, "No matter what happens, love endures." Then he closed the book, ready to face whatever came next. The weeks that followed were a blur of hospital visits, late-night conversations, and quiet moments of reflection. Chuck stayed by Emma's side through every doctor's appointment, every grueling round of treatment, and every sleepless night. He held her hand as she winced in pain, forcing himself to stay strong even as he felt his world unraveling. One afternoon, while Emma was resting, Chuck sat alone in the hospital's small chapel. The soft hum of the fluorescent lights buzzed above him as he stared at the flickering candles lining the altar. He hadn't prayed in years, but that night, he whispered into the silence, asking for strength, not for himself, but for Emma. "She's just a kid," he murmured, his voice cracking. "She deserves a chance at life, at happiness. Take it out on me if you have to. Just don't let her suffer." His plea hung in the air, unanswered. The weight of helplessness threatened to crush him. That evening, Emma surprised him with a request. "Uncle Chuck," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Can we take a drive tomorrow? Just us?" Chuck hesitated. She was so frail, her energy barely lasting through the day, but the spark of determination in her eyes made it impossible to say no. Her eyes made him nod. "Anything you want, kiddo." The next morning, Chuck helped Emma into the car, wrapping her in a blanket to shield her from the crisp winter air. "Where to?" he asked, trying to sound cheerful. Emma smiled faintly. "Somewhere with a view." They drove for hours, winding through the hills outside Los Angeles. Emma gazed out the window, her face illuminated by the golden light of the setting sun. Chuck glanced at her often, memorizing every detail, the curve of her smile, the way her hair framed her face, the quiet strength in her gaze. Finally, they reached a secluded overlook, the city sprawling beneath them in a sea of twinkling lights. Chuck parked the car, and they sat in comfortable silence, the hum of the engine their only companion. "Do you remember the time you taught me to ride a bike?" Emma asked suddenly, her voice tinged with nostalgia. Chuck chuckled. "I remember you falling at least 10 times before you got the hang of it." Emma laughed, though it was weak. "And you ran after me every single time, even when I said I didn't need help." "That's what uncles are for," he replied, his tone light, but his heart heavy. Emma turned to him, her expression serious now. "You've always been there for me, Uncle Chuck, through everything. I don't think I'd have made it this far without you." Chuck swallowed hard, the lump in his throat making it difficult to speak. "You're stronger than you know, Emma. I'm just here to remind you of that." When they finally returned home, Emma was exhausted but content. She leaned against Chuck as he carried her to her room, her breathing soft and steady. "Thank you for today," she whispered as he tucked her in. "It was perfect." Chuck sat beside her, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Get some rest, Bright Star," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "We've got more adventures to plan." As he left the room, he paused in the doorway, watching her sleep. The ache in his chest was unbearable, but he knew he had to stay strong, for her and for the promise he made. In the days that followed, Chuck began working on something special. Late at night, while Emma slept, he poured his heart into a project that would show her just how much she meant to him. He gathered her drawings, notes, and photographs, compiling them into a book filled with their shared memories. On the final page he wrote, "My bright star, you've taught me the true meaning of love and courage. No matter where life takes us, you'll always be with me. Love, Uncle Chuck." Chuck took the sketchbook, his hands trembling as he glanced down at the page. It was a drawing of the two of them, Emma leaning against his side, her eyes bright with laughter, and Chuck with his arm around her, protective and strong. Beneath the sketch, in her delicate handwriting, she had written, "Love doesn't fade, it lives on." Chuck swallowed hard, his chest tightening as he traced the words with his fingers. "It's beautiful, Emma," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. She gave him a tired but content smile. "I wanted you to have something to remember." Chuck shook his head, forcing back the tears threatening to spill. "I don't need a drawing to remember, Bright Star," he said, gripping her hand gently. "You're part of me. Always." Emma squeezed his hand weakly, her eyelids heavy. "I love you, Uncle Chuck. I love you more, kiddo." That night, as the storm settled outside, Chuck sat by Emma's side, holding her hand long after she had fallen asleep. He stared at the drawing, committing every line, every word to memory. He wasn't ready to say goodbye. And in his heart, he knew he never truly would. Chuck looked down at Emma's drawing, two figures standing beneath a cherry blossom tree, sunlight streaming through the branches. Above them, warm rays bathed the scene in a golden glow. Beneath the sketch, in delicate handwriting, she had written, "Thank you for being my light, even when everything felt dark." Tears blurred Chuck's vision. He tried to speak, but his voice failed him. "Emma," He finally managed, his heart breaking. She gave him a weak smile. "I wanted you to have this," she whispered, her strength fading. "So you'll always remember. You were my hero." Chuck pulled her into a gentle embrace, his tears falling into her hair. "I'll never forget, Emma. Not ever." That night, she drifted into a deep sleep, her breathing steady but faint. Chuck sat by her side, holding her hand, whispering the stories they had always shared. In the early hours of the morning, as the first rays of sunlight broke through the storm clouds, Emma quietly passed away. Her face was peaceful, her spirit at rest. Chuck held her hand long after, his heart shattered yet grateful for every moment they had spent together. In the days that followed, he found solace in the pieces of her she had left behind. The sketches, the laughter, the love that had changed his life forever. He honored her by publishing the book he had created, a tribute to their journey, their unbreakable bond. Titled Bright Star, the book became a beacon of hope for others facing loss, reminding them that even in darkness, love could shine brighter than any star. Years later, Chuck stood in a quiet meadow, a single cherry blossom tree blooming at its center. At its base, he placed a small plaque engraved with Emma's words, "Family is who you hold on to when the world lets go." As the wind carried soft petals around him, he closed his eyes, feeling her presence in the warmth of the sun and the whisper of the breeze. She was gone, but her light would never fade. And in that moment, Chuck knew he had kept his promise to live, to love, and to never let the sadness win.